Consider, for a moment, how ideas emerge from failure, not from triumph, not from the careful application of accepted wisdom, but from spectacular, public collapse. In 1884 Vienna, a young doctor destroyed his reputation with a substance that promised everything and delivered catastrophe. What he discovered in that wreckage would reshape how humanity understands itself. This is not a story about getting it right. This is about what happens when getting it spectacularly wrong forces you to ask better questions. Questions about the mind that no one had dared to ask. Questions that would scandalize society, fracture friendships, and ultimately reveal forces driving human behavior that operate beneath the surface of conscious thought, like currents moving through dark water. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Vienna in 1884 possessed the kind of beauty that made you forget about suffering. Baroque facades caught the morning light just so. Horse carriages clattered over cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of passage. Gas lamps flickered on at dusk, casting warm pools of illumination along streets where Strauss waltzes drifted from concert halls and coffee houses served pastries with names like poetry. The empire felt eternal, elegant, secure. In a modest apartment on a street that history would remember, 28-year-old Sigmund Freud prepared a solution of cocaine and injected it into his arm. He was desperate. Understand this, the desperation mattered as much as the drug. Young doctors in Vienna existed in a peculiar purgatory of poverty and ambition. Brilliant minds trapped in a system where advancement came through connections rather than talent, where Jews faced barriers no amount of genius could penetrate, where financial security remained perpetually out of reach. Freud had delayed marriage to Martha Bernays for years because he could not support a wife on a junior physician's salary. He needed a breakthrough, something remarkable, something that would make his name. Cocaine seemed like that miracle. The substance had captured medical attention across Europe. Physicians reported it eliminated fatigue, enhanced mental clarity, banished depression, and required no special expertise to administer. Pharmaceutical companies manufactured it freely. You could purchase it from any apothecary. Freud obtained his supply from Merck, the same firm that produces medications today, and began what he called a thorough study of its effects. But this was no dispassionate research. Freud injected himself repeatedly, documenting euphoria that made his fingers fly across the page, energy that sustained him through nights of writing, confidence that dissolved his usual anxiety. He prescribed it to patients for depression, for digestive problems, for morphine addiction. He sent samples to Martha. He wrote a paper titled Über Coca, on cocaine, singing its praises as a magical drug with seemingly no drawbacks. One passage from that paper reveals everything about what would follow. A small dose lifted me to the heights in wonderful fashion. The heights. Listen to that phrase. A doctor describing a medication as if it were a spiritual experience, as if chemistry could elevate not just mood but something deeper, the self itself. This was not science. This was alchemy, the transformation of substance into transcendence. And Freud wanted to share this transcendence with the world. He convinced his friend Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow to try cocaine as treatment for morphine addiction. Ernst was a tragic figure even before cocaine entered the story. A physiologist of considerable talent, he had contracted an infection after cutting his thumb during a post-mortem examination. Surgeons amputated his thumb. The infection persisted. They removed his hand. The pain remained, unbearable and constant. Ernst turned to morphine for relief, developed an addiction that consumed him, and now existed in a twilight state between agony and opiate fog. Freud proposed cocaine as a cure, not as a substitute as a cure. Take this substance to eliminate dependence on that substance. It sounds absurd now, but you must understand the seduction of the idea. If cocaine could eliminate morphine cravings without itself becoming addictive, it would solve one of medicine's most intractable problems. Patients suffered terrible withdrawals from morphine. Many physicians considered addiction incurable. A substance that freed people from such bondage would be worth more than gold. Ernst agreed to the treatment. For a few weeks, it appeared to work. Ernst reported feeling better, more alert. The morphine cravings seemed to diminish. Freud observed these improvements with the kind of hope that blinds judgment. He wanted so desperately for this to succeed that he missed what was actually happening. Ernst was not recovering. He was transferring his addiction from one substance to another, and cocaine's grip proved even more vicious than morphine's had been. By spring of 1885, Ernst was injecting cocaine continuously, not occasionally, not medicinally, continuously. 1 gram per day became 2 grams, 2 became 3. His behavior deteriorated. He experienced paranoid delusions, seeing insects crawling beneath his skin. He would pick at his arms until they bled, trying to extract creatures that existed only in his cocaine-ravaged mind. Friends who visited him reported a man transformed into something unrecognizable, a skeletal figure trapped in a nightmare of his own physiology. In October of 1885, Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow died. The medical community responded with fury. Other physicians had already begun documenting cocaine's dangers. Reports emerged of addiction, of psychosis, of deaths from overdose. Albrecht Erlenmeyer, a prominent psychiatrist, published an article calling cocaine the third scourge of humanity after alcohol and morphine. He did not mention Freud by name. There was no need. Everyone in Vienna's medical circles knew who had championed the drug most enthusiastically. The professional journals that had once published Freud's work now published his destruction. Reviews called his cocaine research reckless and irresponsible. Colleagues who had nodded politely at his presentations now avoided him in hospital corridors. The breakthrough that was supposed to establish his reputation had instead marked him as dangerous. A physician whose judgment could not be trusted. A man who killed his friend with a treatment he had promised would heal. Freud withdrew the cocaine paper from circulation. He would later try to erase this chapter from his biography, downplaying his role, suggesting he had merely been an early researcher who moved on when better data emerged. But the damage was done. His medical career in neurology, the path he had spent years training for, was effectively finished. Most people would have retreated, found a comfortable general practice somewhere quiet, treated respectable ailments with respectable methods, built a modest reputation back from ruins. Freud did something different. He asked a question that the cocaine disaster had exposed. What if the chemistry was the wrong approach entirely? Cocaine had failed because it tried to fix the mind through the body. It altered neurotransmitters, yes. It changed brain chemistry, certainly. But the relief it provided was temporary and destructive because it never addressed what the mind itself was doing. The morphine addiction, the depression, the anxiety, these were not simply chemical imbalances. They were symptoms of something deeper, something that substances could mask but never resolve. Freud began to wonder if the mind could be studied directly, not through drugs, not through the physical examination of tissue, but through listening, through paying attention to what people said about their inner experiences, especially the experiences they found most difficult to speak about. In October of 1886, he opened a private practice at Burgasse 19, a ground-floor apartment in Vienna's Alsergrund district. The brass nameplate read simply, Dr. Sigmund Freud, Nervous Diseases, Consultation Hours, 2 to 4. Nervous diseases. The category encompassed everything medicine could not otherwise explain: paralysis without physical cause, pain with no tissue damage, fears that destroyed lives, obsessions that consumed minds. Patients with nervous diseases were often dismissed as weak-willed or hysterical, their symptoms considered imaginary even when those symptoms were devastatingly real. Freud accepted them. What else could he do? His reputation was ruined. No respectable neurological practice would hire him. The patients no one else wanted were the only patients he could get. The first patient to truly change everything was Emma Eckstein. She arrived in early 1892, a woman of 27, with symptoms doctors had declared psychosomatic. Stomach pains, menstrual difficulties, difficulty breathing. She had consulted numerous physicians. They found nothing wrong physically. They suggested she was imagining things, that her problems were nervous in nature, that perhaps she should learn to control her emotions better. Freud began treating her with the methods he had learned in Paris from the great neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot's hypnosis and suggestion. The idea was simple. Put the patient in a trance state, suggest the symptoms would disappear, and let the power of suggestion cure what medicine could not. It did not work. Or rather, it worked temporarily, and then the symptoms returned, often stronger than before. So Freud tried something radical. Instead of telling Emma what to think, while hypnotized, he asked her to speak freely, say whatever came to mind, do not censor, do not worry about making sense, just speak. And Emma, under hypnosis, began to remember. She described experiences from childhood, memories she insisted she had not thought about in years, memories that Victorian society insisted could not be real, because no one did such things to children, memories of sexual experiences, of adults who should have protected her instead violating her, of a world where the elegant facades concealed casual cruelty. Freud was stunned. Not because he disbelieved her, though belief required courage in a society that considered such accusations impossible, but because Emma's memories seemed to explain her symptoms. The stomach pains coincided with the location of the abuse. The breathing difficulties emerged during situations that reminded her unconsciously of the original trauma. Her mind had buried the experiences to protect her, but the body remembered. The symptoms were not imaginary. They were the only language her buried memories could speak. This was something entirely new, not chemistry acting on the brain, not suggestion overriding symptoms, but the mind itself revealing its own hidden structure. Memories that existed outside conscious awareness, yet shaped every aspect of current experience. Trauma that did not fade with time, but instead went underground, emerging as mysterious illnesses that baffled physicians because they were looking in the wrong place. Freud began seeing this pattern in patient after patient. The respectable woman with paralyzed legs who recalled childhood sexual assault, the successful businessman with debilitating anxiety who recovered memories of his father's rage, the young man with inexplicable fears who slowly unearthed experiences his conscious mind had banished completely. Every case suggested that beneath the conscious mind, the thoughts and feelings we know about, the intentions we acknowledge there, existed another realm, an unconscious mind, a place where forbidden desires, unacceptable memories, and unbearable truths were stored away, not erased but hidden, continuing to exert force on our lives without our knowledge. This unconscious mind operated by its own rules. It did not care about logic. It ignored time treating events from 20 years ago as if they were happening now. It spoke in symbols rather than words, and it could not be accessed directly through normal consciousness. You had to find indirect routes, dreams, slips of the tongue, free association, where patients said whatever came to mind without censoring. The scandal of cocaine had destroyed Freud's medical career, but that destruction had freed him to pursue something more radical than medicine. He was no longer trying to fix brains. He was attempting to map the unmappable, the territory of human consciousness that existed beyond awareness, the driving forces that shaped behavior without permission, the desires too dangerous to acknowledge, yet too powerful to eliminate. On the door of his practice at Bergasse 19, the brass nameplate still read, "Nervous diseases." But inside those rooms, something else was happening. A new science was being born from failure, an investigation into the parts of ourselves we cannot see but which see everything, that know us better than we know ourselves, that speak truths we spend our lives trying not to hear. The medical establishment had rejected Freud for championing a substance that promised easy answers. Now he would offer them something far more disturbing, evidence that easy answers do not exist, that the mind is not a machine to be repaired with the right chemical key, that we are strangers to ourselves, driven by forces we did not choose and cannot fully control, playing out patterns written in childhood that we do not remember but cannot escape. Vienna's gas lamps still flickered on at dusk. Horse carriages still clattered over ancient cobblestones. Strauss waltzes still drifted from concert halls, but in one modest apartment on Bergasse, the elegant certainties of the age were being systematically dismantled, patient by patient, memory by memory, revelation by revelation. And this was only the beginning. Every night, we surrender consciousness. We close our eyes, and for hours exist in a state so strange that if it happened while awake, we would consider ourselves insane. We see people who are dead. We fly without wings. We stand naked in public places. We speak with animals. The laws of physics dissolve. Time collapses. And when we wake, we dismiss these experiences as meaningless noise, random firings of neurons, the brain taking out its trash. Freud believed we were wrong. Spectacularly, provably wrong. Beginning in 1895, he embarked on what he would later call the most difficult and important work of my life. Not treating patients, though he continued that. Not reading the works of other scientists, though he consumed them voraciously. No, Freud decided to systematically record and analyze his own dreams. Every single one he could remember. 643 dreams, written down immediately upon waking, before the rational mind could smooth away the strange edges, before memory could make them sensible. He kept notebooks beside his bed. When he woke at 3 a.m. from a dream about his dead father wearing the wrong clothes, he lit a candle and wrote it down. When he dreamed of being chased through tunnels that became increasingly narrow, he documented every detail, the texture of the walls, the quality of the fear, the mysterious sense that he had been in these tunnels before, though he had never seen them in waking life. This was not casual curiosity. This was scientific method applied to the one place science had never gone, inside the sleeping mind of the investigator himself. Freud was simultaneously the laboratory, the experiment, and the scientist observing the results. He was mapping territory that existed nowhere except in consciousness, using the only instrument capable of reaching it, attention paid to his own inner experiences. What he discovered there would prove more disturbing than anyone imagined. The first crucial insight came on July 23, 1895. Freud had a dream that would become the most analyzed dream in history. In it, he found himself in a large hall, receiving guests. A patient named Irma was there. Freud examined her throat and saw horrible white patches. Other doctors appeared colleagues who had criticized his work, and they too examined Irma's throat. One of them announced that she had been infected by a dirty syringe. Freud felt vindicated. The illness was not his fault after all. It was caused by someone else's carelessness, with an injection. When he woke, Freud felt an unusual sense of satisfaction. Most dreams leave us with vague unease or quickly fading emotions. This one felt important, significant. He spent the entire day analyzing it, breaking it down element by element, asking himself the question that would become the foundation of psychoanalysis. The answer, when it came, was almost embarrassingly transparent. In waking life, Irma had not responded well to Freud's treatment. Other doctors had suggested his methods were questionable. Freud worried he was harming patients rather than helping them. The cocaine disaster still haunted every clinical decision. And now here was a dream that exonerated him completely. The infection was not his fault. It was someone else's dirty syringe. His treatment was sound. His critics were wrong. The dream fulfilled a wish that Freud could not acknowledge while awake. The wish to be blameless, to have his competence validated, to see his critics humbled. These were not noble desires. They were petty, self-serving, defensive, exactly the kind of thoughts civilized people were trained to suppress. But the dream did not suppress them. The dream staged an elaborate theatrical production where these forbidden wishes came true. This was the revelation. Dreams were not random. They were not meaningless. They were wish fulfillments. Every dream, no matter how bizarre or frightening, represented the fulfillment of a wish that consciousness found unacceptable. But there was more. The dream could not simply present the wish directly because that would wake the dreamer. If Freud had dreamed straightforwardly, "I am a brilliant doctor and all my critics are incompetent," his conscious mind would have recognized this as a wish and rejected it. So the dream disguised the wish. It transformed it into symbols that could slip past the internal censor. The throat examination was not just a throat examination. It was Freud peering into Irma's interior, seeking confirmation that his theories about her interior psychological life were correct. The white patches were not just infection but visible proof of illness, validating that she was truly sick and needed his help. The dirty syringe was not just a medical instrument but a symbol of penetration, of poisoning, of someone else's responsibility for corruption. Freud began to see that dreams operated in a visual language older than words. They took abstract wishes and transformed them into concrete images. They condensed multiple meanings into single symbols. They displaced emotion from its true target onto safer substitutes. They revised and rearranged memories until they became acceptable to the dreaming mind. He called this the dream work, the psychological processes that transformed forbidden wishes into the bizarre narratives we experience during sleep. And once he understood the dream work, he could decode it. He could take any dream, trace it backward through its transformations, and discover the wish it was fulfilling. Night after night, Freud recorded his dreams and then spent his waking hours decoding them. The patterns that emerged were shocking in their consistency and universality. He dreamed of climbing staircases and realized the rhythmic motion represented sexual intercourse. Up and down, up and down. The symbol appeared in dream after dream, sometimes as literal staircases, sometimes as climbing mountains, sometimes as riding in elevators that rose and fell. Always the same underlying wish, sexual desire that civilized consciousness could not acknowledge directly. He dreamed of losing teeth and traced this back to childhood fears of castration, of losing the visible proof of masculinity, of being rendered powerless. The dream transformed an abstract anxiety about potency into the concrete image of teeth falling from the mouth, something that actually happened in childhood, creating a template the adult unconscious could reuse. He dreamed of being naked in public and found beneath it the wish to be seen, truly seen, without the masks and costumes society required. But also the fear of that exposure. The wish and the fear combined into scenarios where he was naked but somehow no one noticed, or where he was naked but felt no shame, or where he tried to cover himself but the covering kept dissolving. Each dream was a compromise formation, a way of letting forbidden wishes into consciousness while simultaneously defending against them. The unconscious said, "I want this," Consciousness said, "You cannot have it." And the dream said, "What if we transform it until you do not recognize what you are seeing?" Freud began testing his discoveries on patients' dreams. A young woman dreamed of a table set with food, but as she reached for it, the table moved away. Freud asked her to freely associate with each element. The table reminded her of her family's dining room. The food made her think of her mother's cooking. The receding motion brought up memories of feeling pushed away, excluded from her parents' intimacy. The dream fulfilled a wish to be invited to the family table, to be nourished, to be wanted. But it simultaneously expressed the reality that this wish was frustrated. The table moved away because that was her experience of family. The dream allowed her to approach what she desired while reenacting the pain of being denied it. Over months of analysis, Freud discovered that dreams about food often concealed wishes about love and acceptance. Dreams about houses represented the dreamer's self, with different rooms corresponding to different aspects of personality, attics for stored memories, basements for primitive urges, locked doors for secrets kept even from oneself. Dreams about travel were wishes for change, for escape, for movement away from an intolerable present into an imagined future. The symbolism was not arbitrary. It emerged from universal human experiences. We all live in bodies. We all have parents. We all learn to walk, to speak, to control our sphincters. We all experience hunger, cold, pain, pleasure. We all discover sexuality. We all fear death. These fundamental experiences create a common symbolic language that the unconscious uses to encode its messages. This meant dreams could be interpreted, not with perfect certainty, Freud warned against that, but with enough reliability to uncover truths the dreamer could not access otherwise. A woman who dreamed repeatedly of narrow corridors that became increasingly constricting might be expressing anxiety about her options in life narrowing. A man who dreamed of flying might be compensating for feelings of powerlessness in waking life. A child who dreamed of monsters under the bed might be projecting aggressive impulses that could not be acknowledged. But here was where the findings became truly radical. The forbidden wishes that dreams fulfilled were not random. They fell into patterns, and those patterns pointed to forces that operated in everyone's mind, shaping behavior from infancy onward. Sexual desire appeared in almost every dream Freud analyzed. Not always, obviously, usually disguised, but there, persistent, undeniable. The dreamer's mind kept returning to sex even when, especially when the dreamer insisted they never thought about such things. This made a terrible kind of sense. Victorian society had constructed an elaborate system of sexual repression. Nice people did not discuss such matters. Physical intimacy was barely tolerated within marriage and absolutely forbidden outside it. Young people were given no education about their bodies. Women were taught to be passive, to endure rather than enjoy. Men were taught to control themselves, to master their animal nature through willpower. But biology did not care about Victorian propriety. The drives persisted, desire persisted, and what consciousness would not acknowledge, the unconscious expressed through dreams. Freud began to see that civilization itself rested on repression. Society functioned only because people learned to deny their primitive wishes for unrestrained sexuality, for aggression against those who frustrated them, for instant gratification of every impulse. We were trained from childhood to delay, to sublimate, to redirect our drives into socially acceptable channels. But the drives did not disappear. They went underground, into the unconscious, and there they continued to operate, shaping our choices, influencing our behavior, creating symptoms when the pressure became too great. Dreams were the nightly proof. Every person who slept had an unconscious mind filled with wishes they could not acknowledge. every dream was evidence that we were not who we pretended to be, that beneath the civilized surface lurked desires and fears and impulses that consciousness worked tirelessly to keep hidden. Freud discovered something else in his dream analysis, something that made the findings even more disturbing. Childhood was not innocent. He traced sexual symbols in dreams back to their origins and kept arriving at early childhood experiences. A woman who dreamed of tunnels remembered crawling under tables as a child, hiding in spaces that felt simultaneously safe and forbidden. A man who dreamed of violence remembered childhood rage at a younger sibling, wishes for that sibling to disappear, fantasies that adults would later insist he could not have had at such a young age. The evidence kept pointing to the same conclusion. Children had sexual feelings. Not adult sexuality that would be absurd, but a diffuse sensuality, a pleasure in the body, curiosity about differences, primitive wishes for exclusive possession of the parent of the opposite sex. Freud called this the Oedipus complex, after the Greek tragedy where Oedipus unknowingly kills his father and marries his mother. Every child, he claimed, experienced something similar, a desire to possess one parent and eliminate the other. For boys, this meant wanting the mother and viewing the father as a rival. For girls, the constellation was more complex, but equally powerful. Critics accused Freud of projecting his own perversions onto normal development. Medical colleagues called his theories a fairy tale, or worse, scientific pornography. But Freud had the evidence. 643 dreams, patterns that repeated across dozens of patients, memories recovered under analysis that patients insisted were real, even though they contradicted everything they had been taught about childhood innocence. And he had one more piece of evidence that was impossible to dismiss: his own experience. In analyzing his dreams, Freud had recovered memories of his own childhood desires and jealousies. He remembered feelings toward his mother that adult morality found unacceptable. He remembered rage toward his father that contradicted the respectful relationship he maintained in waking life. He remembered the exact moment in childhood when he learned to repress these feelings, to bury them so deep that they seemed never to have existed. If this was true of him, a civilized, educated physician who prided himself on rationality, it might be true of everyone. The unconscious was not an aberration found in the mentally ill. It was the normal structure of the human mind. We all had one. We all used it to hide truths too painful or shameful to acknowledge. We all constructed elaborate defenses to keep those truths hidden. Dreams were the crack in those defenses, the one time daily when the unconscious could speak relatively freely, when wishes could be fulfilled in symbolic form, when the truth about our desires leaked through despite our best efforts to contain it. By 1899, Freud had enough material to write his masterwork. He called it The Interpretation of Dreams, 500 pages detailing his theory, his methods, his discoveries. He included dozens of his own dreams, exposing his inner life with a candor that was almost reckless. He knew this book would either establish psychoanalysis as a legitimate science or destroy what remained of his reputation. Publishers rejected it. Too long, too strange, too focused on sex. When it finally appeared in November of 1899, though the publisher dated it 1900 to make it seem more modern, the first edition sold only 351 copies in 6 years. The scientific establishment ignored it. When they acknowledged it at all, they were dismissive. A review in a medical journal called it more clever than convincing. Another described it as a case study in self-deception. But a few people understood what Freud had accomplished. They recognized that he had created a method for accessing psychological truths that had been completely invisible before, that he had demonstrated the mind operated on principles more complex and strange than anyone had imagined. That consciousness was not the whole story, not even the most important part of the story. Those readers began traveling to Vienna. They asked to be trained in the new technique. They wanted to learn how to interpret dreams, how to trace symbols back to their sources, how to help patients recover the buried memories that shaped their current suffering. And Freud, working in his consulting room at Berggasse 19, realized he had done something extraordinary. He had failed at neurology. He had been humiliated over cocaine. He had been rejected by the medical establishment. But through that failure, through that rejection, he had discovered a new continent. Not a geographical place, but a psychological one. The vast territory of the unconscious mind that existed in every human being, as real as any physical organ, as influential as any external force. Dreams were the map to that continent. And Freud was teaching people how to read the map, how to navigate the strange landscape where wishes were laws and symbols were currency, and the rational rules of waking life dissolved into older, deeper patterns. The forbidden laboratory was open. The experiments were ongoing, and what they were revealing about human nature was more radical than anyone outside those consulting rooms could begin to imagine. Revolutions consume their children. This is not metaphor, it is historical pattern. The same passion that unites rebels against the old order eventually turns inward, fragmenting the movement into competing visions of what the revolution should become. The French Revolution devoured Danton and Robespierre. The Russian Revolution executed its own architects. And in a comfortable apartment on Berggasse 19, where ancient Greek artifacts watched from shelves and cigar smoke hung in the air, psychoanalysis began eating its founders alive. Every Wednesday evening, they gathered. 22 men, no women, were initially admitted, crowding around Freud's table in what they called the Wednesday Psychological Society. This was the inner circle, the true believers who had risked their reputations to follow Freud into the unmapped territory of the unconscious. Physicians and intellectuals who understood they were participating in something revolutionary, who felt the thrill of being present at the birth of a new science. Freud presided over these meetings with the authority of a founding prophet. He sat in a particular chair, carved with Egyptian motifs. He lit his cigars in a particular way. He listened to each presentation with fierce attention, then delivered his verdict. Agreement meant inclusion in the movement. Disagreement meant correction, argument, pressure to reconsider. Persistent disagreement meant something more dangerous: exile from the community of understanding, banishment back into the wilderness of conventional thinking. The meetings followed a ritual. One member would present a case or theoretical paper. Others would comment. Freud would synthesize and pronounce. Then they would adjourn for coffee and pastries, the conversation continuing in smaller groups, alliances forming and reforming like molecules in solution. For several years, it worked beautifully. These were brilliant minds united by shared purpose, exploring territory no one had mapped before. They discovered new mechanisms of the mind. They refined techniques for interpretation. They supported each other against the hostility of the medical establishment, which still viewed psychoanalysis as somewhere between quackery and obscenity. But brilliance combined with passion is inherently unstable, and by 1910 the first cracks were appearing. Alfred Adler spoke first, a physician from a working-class background, shorter than average, sensitive about his stature in ways that perhaps influenced his thinking. Adler had noticed something in his practice that did not quite fit Freud's theories. His patients spoke less about sexual repression than about feelings of inferiority. They compensated for weakness, real or imagined, by striving for superiority. The small man became aggressive. The physically ill developed remarkable mental talents. The humiliated child grew into an adult driven to dominate. Adler called this organ inferiority, and later expanded it into a complete theory of personality. People were motivated not primarily by sexual drives, but by the need to overcome feelings of inadequacy. to move from a felt minus to a felt plus. Neurosis resulted not from repressed sexuality, but from faulty compensation strategies. The person who could not accept their limitations and instead constructed grandiose fantasies or developed symptoms that excused failure. When Adler presented these ideas at the Wednesday meetings, Freud listened with increasing agitation. This was not refinement of psychoanalysis. This was betrayal of its fundamental premise. If sexual drives were not central, if childhood sexuality did not shape adult personality, if the Oedipus complex was not universal, then what was psychoanalysis? What distinguished it from every other psychological theory? The arguments grew heated. Adler insisted he was expanding psychoanalysis, making it more comprehensive. Freud countered that Adler was abandoning its most important discoveries in favor of a simpler, more palatable theory, one that people would accept because it flattered them, who would not prefer to see themselves as striving for excellence rather than driven by primitive sexual urges. Other members of the Wednesday Society watched these confrontations with growing alarm. Some sympathized with Adler's emphasis on social factors and conscious striving. Others remained loyal to Freud's insistence on sexual drives and unconscious processes. The room began dividing into camps. In February 1911, Freud forced the issue. During a particularly tense meeting, he stood and announced, "Either Adler leaves or I leave." The silence that followed was absolute. Freud was giving the group a choice: evolutionary modification or revolutionary purity, comfort or truth. And everyone understood that this was not really about Adler's theories, it was about who would define what psychoanalysis was. Adler left. He took several members with him and founded his own school of individual psychology. Within a year, he had developed a complete system that rejected the unconscious, rejected infant sexuality, and focused entirely on conscious goals and social relationships. It was psychoanalysis stripped of everything scandalous, made safe for ordinary practitioners and ordinary patients. Freud declared Adler a heretic. The word seems medieval, but it captures the religious intensity that had infected the movement. Psychoanalysis was not just a medical technique, it was a worldview, a way of understanding human nature that demanded total commitment. Partial acceptance was worse than rejection because it corrupted the truth from within, but Adler's defection was merely the opening act. The real betrayal came from someone far closer to Freud's heart. Carl Jung was everything Freud hoped for in a successor. Tall, charismatic, Swiss, and therefore not Jewish, which mattered in an anti-Semitic Europe where psychoanalysis was already being dismissed as Jewish science. Jung was brilliant, ambitious, and initially worshipful of Freud's genius. He called Freud father. Freud called him my dear son. They exchanged hundreds of letters. They traveled together to America. Freud was grooming Jung to lead the international psychoanalytic movement after his death. But Jung harbored doubts, deep, fundamental doubts that he initially tried to suppress out of loyalty, but which eventually consumed him. Jung did not believe sexuality explained everything. He found in his patients evidence of something broader, what he would later call the collective unconscious, a layer of the psyche, deeper than personal experience, filled with universal symbols and archetypal patterns inherited from humanity's evolutionary past. His patients dreamed of symbols they had never encountered in their personal lives, mandalas, wise old men, great mothers, and these symbols appeared across cultures, across centuries, suggesting something more than individual sexual repression. Jung also struggled with Freud's materialism. Freud insisted that consciousness was produced by the brain, that mental phenomena had physical causes, that there was no soul or spirit, only neurons and drives and defense mechanisms. Jung was drawn to mysticism, to spirituality, to the idea that consciousness might be fundamental rather than derivative. He explored telepathy, studied alchemy and astrology, not as superstitions but as symbolic systems expressing psychological truths. Freud watched these explorations with growing alarm. He had worked so hard to make psychoanalysis scientific, to base it on observable evidence rather than metaphysical speculation. Jung seemed to be dragging it back into the mysticism that Freud had spent his career escaping. But the final break came from something more personal, more human, more devastating than theoretical disagreement. Jung had an affair with a patient. Her name was Sabine Spielrein, and she was 19 years old when she first came to Jung for treatment. Beautiful, troubled, she had been diagnosed as hysterical. Jung treated her with Freudian methods, free association, dream analysis, exploration of childhood trauma. She improved dramatically. She fell in love with him, and Jung, though married, reciprocated. The affair continued for years. Spielrein became pregnant with Jung's child. She miscarried. Jung ended the relationship but could not entirely abandon her. She knew too much, had seen too deeply into his weakness. She began writing her own psychoanalytic papers, brilliant work that anticipated later developments in the field. And she began corresponding with Freud. Jung panicked. He wrote to Freud confessing the affair, but minimizing it, calling Spielrein delusional, suggesting her claims of intimacy were projections and fantasies. He asked Freud, as a fellow analyst who understood transference, to help him manage this difficult patient who had become obsessed with him. Freud did not believe him. The letters from Spielrein were too detailed, too specific. She was not delusional. Jung had violated the most sacred rule of psychoanalysis, the professional boundary between analyst and patient. He had exploited transference. The patient's transferred childhood feelings onto the therapist for sexual gratification. He had done exactly what critics feared psychoanalysts did, using insight into vulnerability as a tool for seduction. Freud confronted Jung during a trip they took together to America in 1913. They were scheduled to speak at various universities, representing psychoanalysis to the New World. But during the ocean voyage, Freud pressed Jung about Spielrein, about the affair, about whether Jung still believed in the fundamental principles of psychoanalysis, or had abandoned them entirely in favor of mystical speculation. Jung defended himself poorly. He accused Freud of being obsessed with sexuality. He suggested Freud's theories revealed more about Freud's own neuroses than about universal human nature. He hinted that perhaps Freud could not understand Jung's broader vision because Freud was trapped in a narrow materialism, unable to perceive spiritual dimensions. The conversation deteriorated into argument. At one point, Freud fainted. Jung had to catch him. When Freud recovered, he looked at Jung with an expression Jung would later describe as haunted. The look of someone seeing betrayal from an unexpected quarter, realizing the heir apparent was neither heir nor apparent, but something else entirely. They completed the American tour in cold politeness. After returning to Europe, the letters between them grew formal, then sporadic, then ceased entirely. Jung resigned from the International Psychoanalytic Association in 1914. He founded his own school of analytical psychology, which kept dream interpretation and the unconscious but rejected sexual drives as primary, emphasized spiritual development, and incorporated ideas about collective inheritance that Freud considered mystical nonsense. The movement was fracturing. Adler had taken the socially conscious practitioners. Jung had taken the spiritually inclined. What remained around Freud was a smaller, more rigid circle, true believers who accepted every premise, who would not question, who valued orthodoxy over innovation. Other defections followed. Wilhelm Steckel left, accusing Freud of being authoritarian. Otto Rank developed his own theory centered on birth trauma rather than sexual development. Sandor Ferenczi pushed for more active techniques that Freud rejected as wild analysis. Each defection took students, took ideas, took portions of the psychoanalytic vision, and rebuilt them according to different specifications. By 1920, psychoanalysis had splintered into 12 distinct schools of thought. Freudian psychoanalysis remained the original, but now it competed with Adlerian individual psychology, Jungian analytical psychology, and various other derivatives. Each claimed to have the true understanding of the unconscious. Each accused the others of betraying the revolution. Freud aged into bitterness. He had expected gratitude from those he trained, loyalty from those he elevated. Instead, he got rebellion. His disciples became his critics. His sons became his rivals. The movement he had birthed to explore the unconscious mind became itself a demonstration of unconscious forces, ambition, rivalry, patricidal wishes, the need to escape the overwhelming father and establish independent identity. The Wednesday meetings continued, but they were different now, more cautious, less innovative. The participants knew that brilliance unaccompanied by absolute loyalty would earn expulsion. Better to refine the existing theories than risk proposing something that might be interpreted as betrayal. In his consulting room, surrounded by his ancient artifacts, Greek gods who had outlasted the civilizations that worshipped them, Freud continued seeing patients, writing papers, developing his theories. He added new concepts: the death drive, repetition compulsion, the structural model of id, ego, and superego. But something was lost. The excitement of discovery had given way to the consolidation of orthodoxy. Perhaps it was inevitable. Perhaps any revolution powerful enough to challenge fundamental assumptions about human nature would generate equally powerful reactions within itself. The unconscious forces that Freud had discovered in his patients operated in him as well, and in his disciples. The need to rebel against the father, the wish to possess what the father possessed: authority, recognition, the power to define reality for others. Psychoanalysis had revealed these dynamics. Now it was living them. The Wednesday Society continued meeting, the letters continued circulating, the papers continued publishing, but the unity was gone. The movement Freud had founded to explore the hidden drives within the individual mind had itself become driven by those same forces, fragmenting into competing tribes, each insisting they alone understood the truth about the darkness we all carry inside. There is a photograph from May 10th, 1933, that captures something essential about how civilizations destroy themselves. 20,000 books burning in Berlin's Opernplatz, flames reaching toward the night sky, students in brown shirts throwing volumes into the fire while chanting slogans. Among those books, every work Freud had published. 25 years of thought, of careful argument, of discoveries about the human mind, consumed by flames while crowds cheered. The students chanted as they threw, against the soul-destroying overestimation of the sex life for the nobility of the human soul, I consign to the flames the writings of Sigmund Freud. Freud, hearing about this in Vienna, reportedly said, "What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Now they are content with burning my books." The joke masked terror. Books burn first, people follow. The Nazi rise to power had been swift and methodical. In January 1933, Hitler became Chancellor. By March, the first concentration camps opened. By May, the book burnings. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. The regime would eliminate anything that complicated its simple narrative about race, purity, and destiny. Psychoanalysis complicated everything. It suggested that beneath Aryan superiority lurked the same primitive drives as in everyone else. It revealed that civilization was a thin veneer, barely containing unconscious forces that cared nothing for racial categories. It insisted that sexual repression created neurosis, directly contradicting Nazi emphasis on rigid gender roles and biological destiny. Most damning of all, psychoanalysis was Jewish, founded by a Jew, practiced predominantly by Jews, associated in the Nazi imagination with everything they meant to purge from German culture. Freud's books disappeared from libraries, psychoanalytic institutes closed, Jewish analysts fled to London, Paris, America. Those who remained faced impossible choices: abandon their profession, practice in secret, or wait for worse to come. Freud stayed in Vienna. He was 77 years old, suffering from jaw cancer that had required 33 surgeries over 15 years. His physician had installed a prosthetic device in his mouth that allowed him to speak and eat, though both caused pain. He could not imagine starting over in a foreign country, learning to navigate new cities, abandoning the consulting room where he had worked for 50 years. Vienna felt safe. Austria was not Germany. The Social Democrats maintained power. Surely civilization would hold. Surely the madness consuming Berlin would not spread across the border. On March 12, 1938, German troops crossed into Austria. The Anschluss annexation was accomplished without resistance. Within hours, Nazi flags flew over Vienna's government buildings. Within days, Jewish businesses displayed signs reading, "Closed by order." Within weeks, Jews were being beaten in the streets while police watched or participated. The Gestapo came to Berggasse 19 times. 4 separate raids, searching for evidence that Freud was hiding assets, that the psychoanalytic publishing house was a front for resistance activities, that forbidden materials were being produced. They ransacked rooms, they confiscated papers, they interrogated staff members. During one raid, Martha Freud, Sigmund's wife of 52 years, confronted the Gestapo officers with extraordinary composure. When they demanded to search Freud's study, she suggested they should knock first, as the professor was seeing a patient. When they rifled through drawers, she watched silently, then asked if they had found what they were looking for. Her calm in the presence of men who could arrest or kill her on whim demonstrated either tremendous courage or an inability to fully comprehend the danger. Freud understood the danger perfectly. He had analyzed enough patients to recognize pathological hatred when he saw it. The Nazis were not political opponents who might be reasoned with. They were acting out unconscious fantasies of purification through elimination, projecting their own unacceptable impulses onto Jews and then seeking to destroy those projections. This was the death drive made social policy. But leaving meant abandoning everything. The antiquities, collection he had spent decades assembling Greek statues, Roman artifacts, Egyptian figurines that sat on every surface of his study. The library containing first editions, rare manuscripts, a lifetime of accumulated knowledge. The consulting room where he had discovered the unconscious, where patients had revealed secrets that changed his understanding of human nature. And there were his sisters, 4 elderly women still living in Vienna: Rosa, Marie, Dolphy, Paula, ranging in age from 73 to 82. They could not make such a journey. They had no connections abroad, no resources to start over. If he left them to whatever fate awaited Jews too old to flee. The decision was made for him when Anna Freud was summoned to Gestapo headquarters. Anna, his youngest daughter, his intellectual heir, the one who had continued his work on child psychology, was interrogated for 8 hours. What they asked, what they threatened, she never fully disclosed. But when she returned to Berggasse 19, Freud saw in her face that staying was no longer possible. He needed an exit visa. But exit visas for Jews required paying the Reich flight tax, a confiscatory levy that could consume entire fortunes. For someone of Freud's prominence, the amount would be astronomical. There was also the emigration tax, the penalty for having foreign accounts, fees for transporting household goods, bribes for various officials who could delay or deny paperwork. Princess Marie Bonaparte intervened. A great-grandniece of Napoleon, patient and friend of Freud, she had wealth that even Nazi Germany hesitated to seize. She travelled to Vienna and negotiated with the authorities. The final amount, 100,000 Austrian shillings, equivalent to approximately $2 million today. While Marie Bonaparte arranged the ransom, Freud prepared to leave. He selected which books to take, which artifacts were small enough to transport, which manuscripts were essential. 32 crates eventually. The accumulation of a lifetime reduced to what could fit in railway cars. On June 4, 1938, the Orient Express carried Freud, Martha, Anna, and a small group of family and associates out of Vienna. They travelled through Nazi Germany, the most dangerous part of the journey. At any moment, officials could board the train, discover some irregularity in the documentation, and take them off. Freud smoked cigars despite his cancer, played cards to appear unconcerned, and watched the countryside pass by, knowing he would never see it again. They reached Paris, then crossed to London. The British government granted asylum to Freud based on his scientific contributions and international reputation. On June 6th, they arrived at Victoria Station. Reporters and photographers crowded the platform. Freud, frail and in pain, descended from the train and was driven to a house prepared for him in Hampstead. He had escaped. But escape is not the same as survival, and survival is not the same as triumph. His 4 sisters remained in Vienna: Rosa, Marie, Dolphy, Paula. They were too old, too poor, too invisible to attract a princess's intervention. As the war progressed and the final solution accelerated, they were deported, Rosa and Marie to Treblinka, Dolphy and Paula to Theresienstadt. All 4 perished in the camps between 1942 and 1943. Freud never learned their exact fates. He died in London on September 23, 1939, 3 weeks after Britain declared war on Germany. Oral cancer had finally metastasized beyond treatment. He asked his physician to administer a lethal dose of morphine, a death chosen rather than endured, consciousness maintained until the final moment. But the ideas escaped. Those 32 crates of manuscripts, papers, and books arrived intact in London. Freud's final works were published posthumously. And something else happened, something neither the Nazis nor Freud himself fully anticipated. The analysts who fled to America would transform a Viennese medical practice into a cultural force that reshaped the New World. Ernest Jones in London. Anna Freud establishing the Hampstead Child Therapy Course. Heinz Hartmann, Ernst Kriss, and David Rappaport bringing ego psychology to America. Erich Fromm, Karen Horney, and Harry Stack Sullivan adapting psychoanalysis to American culture. They carried Freud's ideas across the Atlantic like seeds blown from a burning forest, and those seeds took root in soil far more fertile than the one they left behind. The books had burned, but books are merely containers. The ideas within them, insights about the unconscious, discoveries about childhood development, techniques for exploring inner life, could not be consumed by flames. They existed now in hundreds of trained minds, in thousands of clinical hours, in the accumulated experience of analysts who had learned to listen for what patients could not say directly. Hitler had declared psychoanalysis part of the Jewish plague that must be eliminated from German culture. He believed that burning the books and driving out the practitioners would end the infection. He was wrong. The infection had already spread. It was in the language, in the concepts people used to understand themselves, in the very structure of modern consciousness. Within a decade of Freud's death, psychoanalysis would become more influential in America than it had ever been in Europe. The tragedy of exile would become the condition for transformation. The ideas that Vienna rejected would find in America an audience ready to believe that beneath every civilized surface lurked forces powerful enough to require systematic exploration. The flames in Oppenplatz had reached toward the night sky, consumed 20,000 books, and changed precisely nothing. You cannot burn ideas. You can only scatter them, sending them further than they would have traveled on their own, ensuring they take root in unexpected places. Freud had escaped with his mind intact. His sisters had not. That juxtaposition, ideas surviving while people perish, captures something essential about the 20th century. What matters more, the preservation of human life or the preservation of human knowledge? The question admits no comfortable answer, but history provided one anyway. The ideas survived. They reached London, then crossed to America. And there, they would do something no one expected. They would infect an entire culture. Ideas move through culture the way viruses move through populations. They infect one mind, then spread to others through contact and conversation. They mutate as they travel, adapting to new environments, shedding characteristics that do not fit and acquiring ones that do. And sometimes, rarely, an idea proves so virulent, so perfectly suited to the cultural moment that it transforms the entire society it enters. Freudian psychoanalysis arrived in America as a refugee. Within 20 years, it had colonized the culture. This was not inevitable. America in the 1940s was pragmatic, optimistic, future-oriented. It valued action over introspection, achievement over self-examination. The idea that civilized behavior masked primitive drives, that childhood experiences determined adult neuroses, that sexual repression created symptoms, these were European preoccupations. America was supposed to be different, the new world unburdened by the old world's complexes. But something had happened to America during the war. Soldiers had seen horrors that challenged simple optimism. Concentration camp liberators could not unsee what they had witnessed. The atomic bomb revealed that civilization's highest achievements could produce civilization's greatest terrors. Americans discovered they were not immune to the darkness Freud had described. They needed tools to understand what they had become. Psychoanalysis offered those tools. And it offered them at precisely the moment when American culture was hungry for explanations that went beneath the surface. The infection began in unexpected places, not in universities or hospitals, but in advertising agencies on Madison Avenue. Edward Bernays was Freud's nephew, son of his wife, Martha's sister. He had studied his uncle's work and recognized something Freud himself had not fully appreciated. If unconscious desires drove behavior, then advertising could bypass rational choice and appeal directly to those desires. You did not sell a product, you sold what the product symbolized to the unconscious mind. Bernays approached the American Tobacco Company with a problem. Women did not smoke in public. It was considered unladylike, almost scandalous. How could they expand the market to include half the population? Bernays organized what he called a Freedom March during the 1929 Easter Parade in New York City. He hired young women to walk down Fifth Avenue smoking cigarettes, which he had instructed them to call torches of freedom. He alerted photographers. The images appeared in newspapers across the country, with headlines about women asserting their independence. But the genius was in what Bernays understood and did not say publicly. He was not selling freedom. He was exploiting what Freud called penis envy, women's unconscious sense of lacking something men possessed. The cigarette became a symbolic phallus. Smoking became an act of taking masculine power for oneself. The appeal was not rational, it was unconscious, and it worked spectacularly. Within a decade, cigarette companies were routinely using Freudian concepts to sell products. Advertisements did not mention tobacco quality or price. They showed women looking confident and powerful, men appearing sophisticated and sexual. The message operated beneath conscious awareness. This product will give you what you lack, satisfy the desire you cannot name, transform you into what you wish to become. Other industries learned the lesson. Automobile advertisements emphasized the car as extension of the self, playing on unconscious wishes for mobility and power. Cosmetics sold not beauty but the fantasy of being desired, appealing to deep fears of rejection and invisibility. Food marketing exploited oral fixation, the pleasure of consumption as substitute for other satisfactions. By 1956, Madison Avenue had become the practical application center for Freudian theory. Advertising executives read psychoanalytic journals to understand motivation research. They hired analysts as consultants to decode consumer behavior. They structured campaigns around unconscious drives because those campaigns sold products more effectively than rational arguments about quality or value. America was learning to think psychoanalytically without realizing it. The vocabulary was seeping into everyday speech. People talked about Freudian slips when they missaid words. They spoke of repression and denial. They joked about their complexes and hang-ups. Terms that had been technical concepts in Viennese consulting rooms became ordinary conversation. Hollywood accelerated the infection. Filmmakers discovered that Freudian concepts made compelling drama. Alfred Hitchcock's Spellbound featured a psychoanalyst treating an amnesiac patient, complete with dream sequences designed by Salvador Dali to represent unconscious symbolism. The film was a massive success, and suddenly every studio wanted psychological thrillers exploring the hidden mind. Dream sequences became standard. Characters underwent therapy on screen, revealing traumatic memories that explained their problems. Film noir embraced Freudian themes of double identity, repressed violence, sexual transgression. The femme fatale was not simply evil, but acting out unconscious wishes that civilization forbade. The detective hero was not merely clever, but someone who understood human psychology, who could see through people's defenses to the truth beneath. Psycho terrified audiences with a story about a man who could not escape his mother. The Oedipus complex made literal horror. Ordinary people showed a family destroyed by unspoken trauma, saved only when the son enters therapy and confronts what happened. The Silence of the Lambs featured a cannibal psychiatrist who understood everyone's unconscious motivations better than they understood themselves. Films taught Americans to think like analysts, to look for hidden meanings, to assume that surface explanations concealed deeper truths, to believe that understanding why someone behaved destructively was as important as stopping the destruction. But perhaps the most profound infection occurred in how Americans raised their children. Dr. Benjamin Spock published The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care in 1946. It sold 50 million copies, outselling every book published in America except the Bible. 2 generations of parents relied on it as their guide to child rearing. And it was fundamentally Freudian. Spock told parents to trust their instincts, to respond warmly to children's needs, to avoid rigid schedules and harsh discipline. This was revolutionary advice in an era when experts recommended feeding babies on strict timetables regardless of hunger, letting them cry to avoid spoiling them, and maintaining emotional distance to build character. Spock's approach recognized that early childhood experiences shaped personality, that children needed secure attachment to develop healthy adult relationships, that harsh toilet training could create anal retentive personalities, that sexual curiosity was normal and should not be punished. Every recommendation reflected Freud's discoveries about how childhood trauma produced adult neurosis. Millions of parents followed Spock's advice, without knowing they were practicing applied psychoanalysis. They held their crying babies. They answered questions about sex with age-appropriate honesty rather than shame. They tried to understand misbehavior rather than simply punishing it. They assumed that what happened in childhood mattered enormously for adult happiness. Critics later blamed Spock for creating a generation of indulged, narcissistic adults. But that misunderstood what was happening. Spock was not advocating permissiveness. He was suggesting that children were psychological beings whose inner lives deserved attention, that parenting required insight into unconscious processes, that raising healthy adults meant understanding how the mind developed. The infection spread to education. Progressive schools adopted Freudian principles, creating environments where children could express themselves, where play was recognized as the work of childhood, where imagination was valued alongside obedience. Teachers were trained to watch for signs of trauma or emotional disturbance, to understand that academic failure might mask psychological pain. It spread to the legal system. Courts began accepting testimony about unconscious motivation. Temporary insanity became a defense based on the idea that extreme stress could overwhelm ego defenses, allowing primitive impulses to control behavior. Expert witnesses explained how childhood abuse created personality disorders that diminished responsibility. It spread to art. Salvador Dali painted melting clocks to represent the fluidity of unconscious time, where past and present existed simultaneously. Jackson Pollock's abstract expressionism explored unconscious process, the artist surrendering conscious control to let deeper forces guide the brush. Surrealists made Freudian symbolism visible, the object that was simultaneously itself and something else, the image that meant more than it depicted. Literature became psychological. Stream of consciousness novels tracked interior thought. Characters were given complex backstories explaining their motivations. Modernist fiction assumed readers understood that surface action concealed unconscious drama. To read Virginia Woolf or James Joyce was to think analytically about characters, to interpret their words and actions as symptoms of inner conflict. Even religion adapted. Pastoral counseling incorporated psychoanalytic techniques. Ministers and priests trained in psychology. The idea that spiritual problems might have psychological roots, that confession could be therapeutic, that understanding oneself was part of understanding one's relationship with God. These Freudian concepts infiltrated religious practice. By 1960, 1 in 3 Americans used psychoanalytic terms in daily conversation. That statistic is staggering. A set of ideas that had been considered scandalous 30 years earlier was now ordinary discourse. Americans talked about having issues, working through problems, getting in touch with their feelings. They believed that self-understanding was possible through talk, that the past explained the present, that unconscious forces shaped conscious choices. Psychoanalysis had become American common sense. The revolution was so complete that people forgot it was a revolution. Of course, childhood mattered. Of course, people had unconscious motivations. Of course, talking about problems helped. These truths seemed self-evident, natural, obvious. That they would have seemed bizarre and dangerous to previous generations was forgotten. The analysts who fled Vienna had not simply transplanted a medical practice. They had released into American culture a set of assumptions about human nature that colonized thinking at every level. Advertisers, filmmakers, parents, teachers, lawyers, artists, clergy, all used Freudian concepts because those concepts worked. They explained behavior more satisfyingly than previous frameworks. They offered tools for self-understanding that people desperately wanted. This was the infection's genius. It did not impose itself through authority. It spread through utility. People adopted psychoanalytic thinking because it helped them make sense of their lives. It explained why they repeated destructive patterns, why they chose partners who resembled their parents, why they felt anxious without obvious cause, why dreams disturbed them, why they said things they did not mean to say. Freud had discovered the unconscious by analyzing his own dreams and listening to patients in a Viennese consulting room. His ideas had been rejected by the medical establishment, burned by Nazis, carried into exile. But those ideas had survived and mutated and spread until they became woven into the fabric of American consciousness. You could not escape them. They were in the advertisements that shaped your desires, in the films that structured your fears, in the books that told you how to raise your children, in the vocabulary you used to explain yourself to others. Psychoanalysis was not something Americans practiced. It was something they breathed, like air, invisible and essential. The infection was complete. American culture had become psychoanalytic culture, and there was no going back. For nearly a century, psychoanalysis existed in a peculiar state, widely practiced, culturally influential, and scientifically unproven. Freud's claims about the unconscious, about repressed memories, about childhood trauma shaping adult personality. These were based on clinical observation, on what patients said in consulting rooms, on interpretations that seemed compelling but could not be measured. Critics called it unfalsifiable pseudoscience. Believers called it a different kind of knowledge, one that required different methods than laboratory experiments. Then neuroscience developed tools that could see into the living brain, and everything changed. The functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, fMRI, can record 50,000 measurements per second of blood flow in the brain. Where blood flows, oxygen follows. Where oxygen goes, neurons are active. The machine creates maps of mental activity with spatial resolution measured in millimeters and temporal resolution measured in seconds. For the first time in history, scientists could watch thoughts happening. Researchers began testing psychoanalytic claims, not with questionnaires or clinical impressions, but with hard data. Brain scans of people experiencing specific psychological states, measurements of neural activity during particular mental processes, evidence that could be quantified, replicated, published in journals that demanded rigorous methodology. The results were shocking, not because they disproved Freud, but because they validated him. Mark Solms, a neuropsychologist who trained as a psychoanalyst, pioneered much of this research. He placed volunteers in fMRI machines and asked them to free associate to say whatever came to mind without censoring. Then he compared their brain activity to when they performed focused, goal-directed thinking. During free association, the default mode network activated. This network includes the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and medial temporal lobes. It operates when the mind is not focused on external tasks during daydreaming, remembering, imagining the future. This is the brain's resting state, the activity that continues when we are not consciously directing our thoughts. But Solms noticed something else. During free association, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for executive control, for censoring inappropriate responses, for maintaining social appropriateness, showed decreased activity. The brain's internal editor was shutting down. This was Freud's model made visible. The unconscious was not a metaphor. It was neural activity in specific brain regions operating below the level of conscious awareness. The censor Freud described the mechanism that kept unacceptable thoughts from consciousness, corresponded to prefrontal regions that normally inhibit impulses and regulate emotion. When you relaxed that censorship through free association, unconscious material could surface, not because you were imagining it, but because you were allowing existing neural activity to reach awareness. Other researchers examined repressed memories. This was the most controversial of Freud's claims that traumatic experiences could be completely forgotten yet continue influencing behavior, and that they could be recovered through psychoanalytic techniques. Elizabeth Loftus and others had demonstrated that false memories could be implanted through suggestion, leading many to conclude that recovered memories were therapist-induced confabulations. But more careful research revealed a more complex picture. James McGarr at UC Irvine studied the neurobiology of emotional memory. He discovered that stress hormones, particularly cortisol and adrenaline released during trauma, enhance memory consolidation in the amygdala while potentially disrupting hippocampal function. The hippocampus is crucial for explicit, conscious recall of events. The amygdala stores emotional associations and implicit memory. What this means: traumatic experiences can be encoded in the amygdala without being properly consolidated in the hippocampus. The person retains the emotional response, fear, anxiety, physical tension without explicit memory of what caused it. This is Freud's repression made neurobiological. The memory exists but cannot be consciously accessed through normal recall. It manifests as symptoms, panic attacks, phobias, somatic complaints, without the person knowing why. Bessel van der Kolk extended this research by scanning the brains of trauma survivors. When they recalled traumatic events, their amygdalas showed hyperactivity, while Broca's area responsible for speech production showed decreased activity. The trauma was literally unspeakable. Their brains could not put the experience into words, even as they relived the emotions. But here is what validated Freud most powerfully. The pattern of symptoms these patients exhibited matched exactly what he had described. Body memories, appearing without conscious recall, phobias emerging from unremembered events, relationship patterns repeating childhood dynamics the patient insisted they had forgotten. The neuroscience confirmed that unconscious memory was real, that it operated differently from conscious recall, and that it profoundly influenced behavior. Then researchers examined sleep and dreaming. Freud had claimed dreams fulfilled unconscious wishes through symbolic disguise. For decades, this seemed like Victorian fantasy. Dreams were random neural noise, most scientists insisted, meaningless patterns generated by a brain doing housekeeping during sleep. Matthew Walker at UC Berkeley demonstrated otherwise. During REM sleep, when most vivid dreaming occurs, the prefrontal cortex deactivates, while the limbic system, including the amygdala, shows heightened activity. The rational, logical part of the brain goes offline. The emotional, associative parts take over. This is precisely the state Freud described, the sensor relaxing, allowing unconscious material to emerge. Walker showed that REM sleep processes emotional experiences. Traumatic memories lose some of their emotional intensity after a night of adequate REM sleep. The brain is literally integrating difficult experiences, stripping away the most painful affect while retaining the lessons learned. This is dream work, not wish fulfillment in the simple sense Freud sometimes suggested, but psychological processing that allows threatening material to be experienced in a safer form. Other studies found that dreams incorporate recent concerns and long-standing preoccupations in ways that suggest problem-solving. Not conscious problem-solving, but the unconscious making connections between current challenges and past experiences, trying out scenarios, exploring possibilities. Freud was right that dreams meant something, that they revealed the mind working on problems consciousness could not solve. The symbolism was trickier. Researchers could not confirm that staircases universally represented sexual intercourse, or that losing teeth meant castration anxiety. Symbols appeared to be more personal than Freud claimed, shaped by individual experience rather than universal meaning. But the core insight held. Dreams used visual metaphors to represent psychological states. They condensed complex feelings into single images. They disguised wishes that would be too disturbing if directly acknowledged. They provided a space where impossible scenarios could be safely explored. The mechanism Freud described was operating, even if the specific symbol dictionary needed revision. Perhaps most dramatically, researchers demonstrated that psychoanalytic therapy produces measurable changes in brain structure. This was crucial because critics had long claimed that talking could not alter neurology, that real treatment required medication to change brain chemistry. Jeffrey Schwartz studied patients with obsessive-compulsive disorder who underwent cognitive therapy, a descendant of psychoanalytic techniques. Before treatment, their orbital frontal cortex showed hyperactivity during obsessive thoughts. After 12 weeks of therapy, brain scans showed this activity had normalized. Talking had rewired the brain as effectively as medication. Other studies showed that long-term psychotherapy increased gray matter volume in regions associated with emotion regulation. That successful analysis of childhood trauma reduced amygdala reactivity. That patients who learned to mentalize, to reflect on their own and others' mental states, showed enhanced connectivity between prefrontal regions and limbic areas. The mechanism seemed to involve neuroplasticity, brain's ability to form new connections and pathways based on experience. When patients repeatedly practiced observing their thoughts without judging them, reflecting on patterns rather than simply reacting, they were literally building new neural circuits. The insight that psychoanalysis aimed for was not just intellectual understanding, but structural change in how the brain processed emotion and memory. Mark Solms synthesized these findings into what he called neuropsychoanalysis, not a rejection of Freud, but a translation of psychoanalytic concepts into neuroscientific language. The unconscious was bottom-up processing from subcortical regions. Repression was failure of information to reach prefrontal awareness. Defense mechanisms were predictable patterns of neural activity that protected against overwhelming affect. Transference was the brain's tendency to use past relationship templates when processing new social interactions. Every major psychoanalytic concept had a neural correlate. This did not mean Freud was right about everything. His theories about female sexuality were clearly products of Victorian prejudice. His death drive remained controversial. His emphasis on sexual etiology was probably overstated. But the core architecture of psychoanalysis, that unconscious processes influence behavior, that childhood shapes the developing brain in lasting ways, that talking therapy can produce neurological change, was validated by objective measurement. Critics who had dismissed psychoanalysis as unfalsifiable were forced to reconsider. The fMRI did not lie. The blood flow patterns showed what was happening in the brain during psychoanalytic processes. And what was happening looked remarkably like what Freud had described based purely on clinical observation. This created a strange situation. Psychoanalysis had declined in medical schools and psychology departments during the 1980s and 90s, replaced by biological psychiatry and cognitive behavioral therapy. Young clinicians learned to treat symptoms with medication and brief, structured interventions, rather than exploring unconscious conflicts through long-term analysis. But now neuroscience was revealing that the brain operated psychoanalytically, that unconscious processing was not a metaphor but a description of how neural networks function. That early experience literally shaped brain development. That emotional memory followed different rules than explicit memory. That insight-oriented therapy produced lasting neurological changes. Some psychiatrists began integrating the findings. They recognized that medication might relieve symptoms while psychotherapy addressed underlying neural patterns. That treating depression with antidepressants was valuable, but understanding why someone was vulnerable to depression required exploring their history, their relationships, their unconscious beliefs about themselves. Medical education slowly changed. Students who had been taught that Freud was irrelevant now learned about the default mode network and its relationship to psychoanalytic concepts. They studied how trauma altered brain development in ways that matched psychoanalytic theories of early attachment. They saw brain scans demonstrating that the unconscious was not mysticism but neurobiology. Freud had died in 1939, convinced that someday biology would validate his discoveries. He had written that psychoanalysis was a provisional science, a way of understanding the mind until neuroscience developed sufficient tools to examine the brain directly. He expected future researchers to translate his psychological concepts into biological mechanisms. Exactly that was happening. The validation came 90 years after he began his dream research, 60 years after his death. But it came. The unconscious existed. Repression occurred. Childhood experiences shaped adult neurology. Dreams processed emotion. Therapy changed brain structure. Every major claim had evidence. This did not resurrect psychoanalysis in its classical form. The 50-minute daily sessions, the analyst sitting silently behind the couch. The years of analysis, these seemed extravagant in an age that demanded efficiency. But the fundamental insights were being preserved and updated, integrated into modern psychiatry and neuroscience. The brain was more Freudian than anyone expected, and as scanning technology improved, as researchers developed better methods for studying unconscious processes, the convergence between psychoanalysis and neuroscience seemed likely to deepen. Freud had mapped the mind by listening. Neuroscientists were mapping the brain by imaging, and the maps, remarkably, aligned. The territory they described was the same territory. The unconscious was real. It could be seen, measured, studied, and understanding it remained as important as Freud had claimed, perhaps more so, now that we could see in precise detail how deeply it shaped everything we thought we consciously chose. 141 years after Freud first published his findings, his ideas undergo constant resurrection and rebellion. Each generation rediscovers what the previous generation rejected. Each culture adapts psychoanalysis to its particular needs, while insisting it has moved beyond Freud entirely. The pattern itself is psychoanalytic, the need to kill the father while inheriting everything he created, the compulsion to repeat while denying the repetition. Walk into a therapy room anywhere in the world today, Tokyo or Sao Paulo, Lagos or Stockholm, Mumbai or Toronto. 300,000 psychoanalysts and psychotherapists work globally, helping patients uncover patterns that Freud first identified. The methods have changed, the theories have evolved, but the fundamental discoveries persist because they describe something real about how minds work. The patient sits or lies down. The therapist listens with a particular quality of attention, not simply hearing words but noticing patterns, tracking emotions, observing what is said and what remains unsaid. The conversation circles topics that matter: childhood experiences, current relationships, dreams and fantasies, fears that seem irrational, wishes that seem forbidden. And gradually, if the therapy works, the same phenomena Freud documented begin appearing. Repetition, compulsion. The patient describes a series of failed relationships and slowly realizes each partner resembled the previous one in crucial ways. The unavailable father becomes the emotionally distant boyfriend, becomes the ambivalent husband. The critical mother becomes the demanding boss, becomes the judgmental friend. The pattern repeats not because the person consciously chooses it, but because it is familiar. The unconscious seeks what it knows, even when what it knows causes pain. Freud called this the repetition compulsion, the tendency to recreate childhood scenarios in adult life, attempting to master situations that were overwhelming the first time. The person who is abandoned keeps choosing partners who will eventually leave, unconsciously hoping that this time they can control the outcome. This time they can make the person stay. The compulsion is tragic because it almost never succeeds. The pattern repeats until it is recognized and consciously interrupted. Modern therapists see this constantly. The client who complains about always being betrayed, but who repeatedly trusts untrustworthy people. the executive who keeps getting fired for insubordination, unconsciously reenacting conflicts with an authoritarian parent, the woman who says she wants intimacy but finds ways to sabotage every relationship before it becomes serious. These are not coincidences or bad luck. They are compulsions, unconscious drives to repeat what feels familiar, even when familiar means painful. And recognizing the pattern is the first step toward changing it. The patient must see what they are doing, understand why they are doing it, and then make the difficult choice to act differently, despite every instinct pulling them back toward the familiar pattern. Transference appears next. The patient begins experiencing feelings toward the therapist that seem too intense for the actual relationship. Anger at a minor lateness. Desperate need for approval. Sexual attraction. Profound disappointment when the therapist proves imperfect. Fear of abandonment when sessions end. These feelings do not come from the present therapeutic relationship. They come from the past, from primary relationships with parents and caregivers, transferred onto the therapist who becomes a screen for projecting old emotions. The patient experiences the therapist as the critical father, the abandoning mother, the rival sibling, not because the therapist resembles these figures, but because the patient's mind recreates these dynamics in every significant relationship. Freud discovered that transference was not a problem to be eliminated, but a tool to be used. The feelings revealed the patient's internal world, how they experienced authority, what they expected from intimacy, what they feared about depending on others. The transference was a live demonstration of unconscious patterns that could be examined in real time. Modern therapists still work with transference, though they frame it differently than Freud did. They might call it attachment patterns, or relational schemas, or internal working models. But they are describing the same phenomenon. The past invading the present, childhood patterns determining adult responses, relationships serving as stages where old dramas replay endlessly. And they use the same technique, making the unconscious conscious, pointing out the pattern gently, asking the patient to notice what they are feeling and consider whether this intensity belongs to the present or echoes something older, helping them distinguish between what is happening now and what happened then. Resistance emerges inevitably. Just as the patient approaches significant insight, something stops the process. They miss appointments. They forget dreams. They change the subject. They intellectualize rather than feeling. They attack the therapist or the therapeutic method. They suddenly decide therapy is not helping and perhaps they should quit. Freud taught that resistance was not defiance but protection. The unconscious was defending against truths too painful to acknowledge. The patient wanted to change and simultaneously wanted to remain exactly as they were, because change meant facing what they had spent their entire life, avoiding the reality of what happened to them, who hurt them, what they lost, how they participated in their own suffering. Therapists expect resistance. They see it as a sign that the work is getting close to something important. The defenses activate most strongly just before breakthrough. The trick is helping the patient see the resistance without making them feel criticized for it. To say, "I notice you changed the subject just as we started discussing your father," rather than, "You are resisting." These three phenomena, repetition, compulsion, transference, and resistance, operate in every therapy room regardless of theoretical orientation. Cognitive behavioral therapists encounter them. Humanistic therapists work with them. Even medication-focused psychiatrists notice that some patients resist taking medication that would help them, that they form intense relationships with their doctors, that they keep making choices that perpetuate their suffering. These are Freudian discoveries that have become fundamental observations about human psychology. They are no longer controversial. They are simply how minds work. But psychoanalysis today faces challenges Freud never imagined. Artificial intelligence is developing consciousness, or something resembling it. Virtual reality creates experiences that feel real to the brain. Social media shapes identity in ways that blur the boundary between authentic self and performed persona. Genetic engineering might eventually alter the biological substrates that produce the drives Freud described. How does psychoanalysis adapt to these technologies? Can an AI develop an unconscious? If we upload consciousness to digital form, do repressed memories transfer? When virtual experiences feel as real as actual ones, what happens to the distinction between fantasy and reality that psychoanalysis depends on? Some theorists suggest that AI consciousness, if it emerges, will be fundamentally different from human consciousness, precisely because it lacks the evolutionary history that created the unconscious. No childhood, no parents, no sexual development, no death awareness. The conflicts that generate neurosis in humans might not exist in artificial minds. Others argue that any sufficiently complex information processing system will develop something like an unconscious processes operating below the level of primary awareness, patterns that influence behavior without explicit representation, conflicts between different subsystems that must be resolved through compromise. Virtual reality presents a different challenge. If experiences in VR produce the same neural activity as real experiences, they might create genuine memories and genuine trauma. A person could develop PTSD from something that never physically happened. They could form attachments to digital entities that feel as real as human relationships. The unconscious might not distinguish between actual and virtual experiences. Psychoanalysis would remain relevant because it is fundamentally about subjective experience rather than objective reality. What matters is not whether something actually happened, but whether the person believes it happened and how that belief shapes their inner world. Virtual trauma would require the same therapeutic techniques as actual trauma, helping the person process the experience, integrate the memories, reduce the emotional intensity through retelling and reframing. Social media creates new forms of self-presentation that complicate the already difficult task of knowing oneself. People curate their online identities, performing versions of themselves for different audiences. The boundary between authentic self and false self, a psychoanalytic concept describing the difference between who we truly are and who we pretend to be, becomes increasingly blurred. But this might make psychoanalysis more necessary, not less. As external life becomes more performative, the need for a private space where one can speak truthfully without performance increases. The therapy room remains one of the few places where social media does not reach, where you can say things you would never post, explore feelings you would never share, acknowledge wishes and fears that would destroy your carefully constructed public image. Genetic engineering poses perhaps the deepest challenge. If we can modify the genes that influence aggression, anxiety, sexual drive, attachment patterns, the biological substrates of the drives Freud described, do we eliminate the need for psychotherapy? Why work through an Oedipus complex if we can edit out the genetic factors that produce intense parent attachment? The answer might be that drives are not simply genetic. They emerge from the interaction between biology and experience, between what we inherit and what we live through. Even if we could modify every relevant gene, children would still have parents, still experience dependence and frustration, still develop psychological patterns in response to early relationships. The content of the unconscious might change, but the structure would remain. And there is something else. Something Freud understood intuitively, and neuroscience is now confirming. The drives are not problems to be eliminated. They are the energy that makes us human. Sexual desire creates art and families, and the drive toward connection. Aggression, properly sublimated, becomes ambition, advocacy, the courage to defend what matters. Even the death drive, the controversial idea that we harbor a wish for annihilation, might reflect our need for rest, for release from consciousness, for surrender that makes possible renewal. To eliminate these drives would not create perfect humans. It would create something else entirely, something that felt no passion, no urgent desire, no willingness to risk everything for what it loved. Psychoanalysis is not about eliminating drives, but about understanding them, channeling them, using their energy while not being destroyed by their intensity. This is why Freud's map of the mind remains humanity's most detailed guide to forces that drive us. Not because every detail is correct, much has been revised, updated, discarded, but because the fundamental insight persists. We are not transparent to ourselves. Much of what determines our behavior operates outside awareness. The past shapes the present in ways we do not recognize. We can change, but only by making unconscious patterns conscious, by bringing what was hidden into the light where it can be examined. Every day, in 300,000 therapy rooms around the world, people engage in this work. They lie on couches or sit in chairs. They talk about their dreams, their fears, their relationships, their childhoods. They cry or rage or sit in uncomfortable silence. They resist and break through. They transfer and recognize the transference. They repeat and eventually, sometimes, find new patterns. The therapists listen with the kind of attention Freud pioneered, not trying to fix or advise or reassure, but helping the patient see what they could not see before, reflecting back patterns, interpreting symbols, waiting through the resistance until the truth can be spoken. This is Freud's legacy, not a complete theory that explains everything, not a set of therapeutic techniques that cure all suffering, but a method for exploring inner life, for making sense of the forces that move us, for recognizing that we are deeper and stranger and more complicated than we consciously know. The books burned in Berlin contained this knowledge, but knowledge cannot be destroyed by fire. It persists in minds and methods, in concepts that became ordinary language, in practices that seem obvious only because someone first had to discover them. 141 years after the cocaine scandal, 130 years after the first dream analysis, 85 years after the death in London. The work continues, the discoveries hold, and every person who walks into a therapy room hoping to understand why they suffer and how they might change is following a path that Freud was the first to map. The unconscious remains, the drives persist, the patterns repeat until they are recognized, and the talking cure the strange idea that speaking about suffering can relieve it, that making the unconscious conscious can free us from its grip continues to work its slow transformation, one mind at a time, in the endless dance between what we desire and what we can bear to know about ourselves.